Welcome back to our channel on this beautiful day. The drama in Genoa City is reaching an absolute fever pitch, and we are here to break down every single heart-stopping moment. Grab your coffee, settle in, and prepare yourselves, because the latest developments surrounding our favorite residents are nothing short of explosive. The silence in the empty hotel room was deafening. The ropes were cut, the chair was empty, the desperate, amnesiac man she had bound and gagged as her ultimate bargaining chip was gone. Phyllis Summers stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the frayed edges of the bindings, feeling the air completely leave her lungs. She had played a dangerous game of chess with the devil, and she had just lost her queen. Matt Clark, the monster she thought she could control, the wild card she believed would be her salvation against the ruthless machinery of Victor Newman, had vanished into the wind. And he had not left on his own. The realization hit Phyllis with the force of a physical blow. Patty Williams, the unpredictable, deeply unstable wildcard of Genoa City, had infiltrated her sanctuary and stolen her leverage. The master manipulator had been outmaneuvered, and the sheer, primal panic that washed over Phyllis in that singular moment was unlike anything she had experienced in years. Phyllis had been backed into an impossible corner. Victor Newman, operating with a terrifying, cold-blooded precision, had utilized a stolen artificial intelligence program to manufacture a flawless trail of corporate espionage. He had generated fake emails, fabricated financial transfers, and bought off executives to frame Phyllis for the legal hostile takeover of Newman Enterprises. Christine Blair Romalotti, the newly reinstated district attorney and Phyllis's oldest, most bitter historical rival, was waiting in the wings with federal indictments. The walls of a federal penitentiary were closing in on her. Matt Clark was her get-out-of-jail-free card. He was the one man the Newman family feared more than anything, the boogeyman who had tortured Sharon, addicted Nick to fentanyl, and nearly blown them all to ashes in Las Vegas. Phyllis intended to trade the monster for her freedom, but now, the monster was loose. She ran. Phyllis fled the empty room and retreated to the absolute isolation of her own suite at the Grand Phoenix. The door slammed shut, the deadbolt engaged with a heavy, metallic thud. The chain slid into place, but it was not enough. The physical barriers could not keep out the suffocating dread that was rapidly filling the room. Her chest heaved. Her hands trembled violently as she backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the luxurious suite that suddenly felt like a maximum security prison cell. She was completely exposed. The confident, fiery, unstoppable Phyllis Summers was gone, replaced by a cornered animal trembling in the dark. The phone on the nightstand began to buzz. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying the name of her son, Daniel Romalotti Jr. She stared at it, the vibration sounding like a siren in the quiet suite. She could not answer. She could not face the righteous, heartbroken fury of her son, who had already expressed his profound disgust at her unethical survival tactics. The buzzing stopped, only to be immediately replaced by another incoming call. Lauren Fenmore Baldwin, her best friend. The woman who had stood by her through every catastrophic mistake, every reckless scheme, and every bitter downfall. Lauren was likely calling to strategize, to offer the legal counsel of Michael Baldwin, to find a way out of the framed nightmare. Phyllis silenced the device. She threw it across the bed, watching it sink into the heavy duvet. She refused their help. She refused to let them see her like this. She was isolating herself, building a fortress of solitude because the shame and the terror were simply too immense to share. The glowing screen of her laptop beckoned her from the desk. Drawn by a morbid, masochistic curiosity, Phyllis opened the browser. Her trembling fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed in the name that was currently haunting her every waking thought. Matt Clark. The search results cascaded down the screen in an endless, horrifying waterfall of trauma. Headlines from years past screamed back at her. The kidnapping, the extortion, the psychological torture of Sharon Newman, the brutal, violent history of a man who took pleasure in the absolute destruction of his victims. Phyllis clicked on article after article, her eyes scanning the horrific details of his crimes. She read about the Las Vegas explosion, the underground bunker, the sick, twisted games he played with Nick and Adam Newman. She read about the fentanyl, the lethal doses he used to break a good man down into a shivering, addicted shell of himself. The sheer magnitude of Matt Clark's evil washed over her, chilling her to the very marrow of her bones. She had read these stories before. Of course, she knew who he was. But knowing it intellectually and facing the reality of what she had just done were two entirely different things. She had looked into the empty, amnesiac eyes of this psychopath and seen an opportunity. She had played the role of his savior, feeding him lies, manipulating his fractured mind, all to save her own skin. She thought she could tame a monster. She thought she could keep the devil on a leash. And this is the moment I almost screamed at the screen. How could Phyllis, a woman who had survived the psychological torture of Martin Gray, a woman who knew intimately what it felt like to be locked away and manipulated by a madman, ever believe she could successfully play God with someone as lethal as Matt Clark? The arrogance, the sheer, blinding hubris of her plan was staggering, and now, the catastrophic consequences were crashing down upon her. The guilt hit her like a freight train. It was a rare, paralyzing emotion for Phyllis Summers. She had always justified her actions, always found a way to blame Victor, or Christine, or Diane. But this was entirely on her. By holding Matt hostage, by poking the sleeping bear, by trying to weaponize his amnesia, she had inadvertently set him free. She had unleashed a monster back into the streets of Genoa City. The realization that Matt Clark was out there, wandering the city, potentially regaining his lethal memories with every passing second, made her physically nauseous. She thought of Sharon, living in her cottage, entirely unaware that her greatest nightmare was no longer safely tucked away. She thought of Nick, currently fighting for his life against the very addiction Matt had forced upon him, completely vulnerable to another attack. And then, the true horror of the situation settled into her fracturing mind. Matt was not just wandering alone. He was with Patty Williams. The combination of those two names in the same sentence was enough to make the blood freeze in her veins. Patty, the woman who had shot Victor Newman, the woman who had terrorized the Abbott family, the woman whose grasp on reality was as fragile as spun glass. Patty had taken Matt. Patty was now the one whispering in his ear, guiding his fractured mind, pointing him like a loaded weapon at whatever target her delusions deemed necessary. Phyllis realized she had not just lost a hostage, she had handed a weapon of mass destruction over to a lunatic. The blood that would inevitably spill in Genoa City would be entirely on her hands. The tension in the hotel room spiked. The air grew impossibly thin, as shadows shifted near the heavy velvet curtains. Phyllis gasped. She jumped back, her spine colliding with the edge of the dresser. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared into the dark corner of the room, her eyes wide, searching the gloom. Is he there? Is Matt there? Did he find his way back? She held her breath, waiting for the glint of a knife, the cold, dead stare of his eyes. She blinked. The shadow resolved itself into the shape of a floor lamp. Nothing. There was nothing there. But the fear did not dissipate. It clung to her skin like a damp, freezing shroud. The paranoia was taking deep, unshakable root in her psyche. The hallucinations began slowly, insidious whispers in the quiet of the room. She heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking coming from the air conditioning vent. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the hallway outside her door. She crept toward the entryway, pressing her ear against the cool wood. Silence. But then a voice. A low, mocking whisper that seemed to echo from the very walls of the suite. It was Matt's voice. He was telling her she had protagonist energy. He was repeating the exact, chilling words he had spoken to her at the bar of the Grand Phoenix right before she had lured him into her trap. The words bounced around inside of her skull, amplifying in volume until she covered her ears with her hands, squeezing her eyes shut. Stop it, she whispered to the empty room. Stop it, stop it, stop it. But it did not stop. The monster was no longer just out there in the city. He was inside her head. Her mind, already stretched to the absolute breaking point by Victor's legal threats and the betrayal of her own son, was finally snapping under the weight of this ultimate failure. She was regressing. The fierce, independent woman who had built empires and destroyed enemies was gone. In her place was the traumatized victim of Martin Gray, the woman who had been locked in a room, gaslight, and tortured until she didn't know what was real and what was a nightmare. Matt Clark was breaking her down without even being in the room. His mere existence, the knowledge that she had set him loose, was enough to completely shatter her sanity. A sudden, violent pounding on the door made her scream. Mom, Mom, open the door. I know you're in there. It was Daniel. His voice was muffled through the heavy wood, thick with worry and frustration. Phyllis froze. She remained crouched on the floor, her hands still clamped over her ears. She wanted to move. She wanted to throw the deadbolt, to fall into her son's arms, to confess everything and beg for his forgiveness. But the fear paralyzed her. What if it wasn't Daniel? What if it was a trick? What if Matt was standing right behind him, holding a gun to his head, forcing him to speak? The paranoia was absolute. It painted every interaction with the brush of lethal danger. She trusted no one. She couldn't even trust her own senses. Phyllis, please. Warren's voice joined the chorus, laced with genuine, terrified panic. Michael is talking to Victor right now. We can fix this, but you have to let us in. You cannot do this alone. Phyllis pressed her back harder against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the carpet, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. She rocked back and forth, staring blankly at the door. They didn't understand. They thought the threat was Victor Newman. They thought the threat was a federal indictment and a courtroom battle with Christine Blair. They had no idea that the real threat was out there, walking the streets, breathing the same air as them. They didn't know that she had opened the gates of hell and let the devil walk out. The irony of her situation was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. She had fought so incredibly hard to maintain her power. She had fought Victor's brilliant, terrifying AI framing. She had fought Michael Baldwin's pragmatic, defeatist legal advice. She had fought Christine's righteous, historical crusade to see her in handcuffs. And for what? To avoid a prison cell. She looked around the dimly lit hotel suite. The heavy curtains, the locked door, the suffocating, inescapable terror. Victor Newman didn't need to put her in federal prison. She had built a maximum security cell right here in the Grand Phoenix, and she had thrown away the key. The climax of her mental breakdown crested like a tidal wave. The whispering in the walls grew louder. The shadows stretched and contorted, taking on the shape of a man. Matt Clark was everywhere. He was in the reflection of the mirror. He was lurking in the dark expanse of the closet. He was waiting for her to close her eyes. In a sudden, violent burst of adrenaline, Phyllis grabbed a crystal water glass from the nightstand and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the opposite wall, sending glittering shards of glass raining down onto the carpet. The sound was sharp, violent, and deafening, but it did not drown out the voices in her head. It did not erase the phantom image of Matt Clark's scarred, mocking face. The monster was free. The monster was coming, and she was the one who had unlocked the cage. The knocking at the door eventually stopped. Daniel and Lauren, defeated by her silence, retreated down the hallway to formulate another plan. The silence returned to the suite. But the silence was infinitely worse than the noise. The silence was when the monsters spoke the loudest. Phyllis Summers sat alone in the dark, entirely consumed by a nightmare of her own making, a prisoner of her own devastating hubris. Will she ever find her way out of this suffocating darkness, or has Matt Clark already claimed his ultimate victim without laying a single finger on her?